So, good evening. Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. My name is Christoph Möllers. I'm a permanent fellow here and teaching constitutional law and legal theory at the Humboldt University. And I'm talking to Lea Ypi tonight, former fellow and professor of political theory at the London School of Economics. Lea grew up in Albania, and we will talk about that, I think, today. After her high school degree, she went to Italy and studied philosophy and literature, got her degrees, then went to in Rome at La Sapienza, then went to the EUI, European University Institute, did her PhD there, became a postdoc at Oxford, became a professor in Australia, and then finally a professor of political theory at the London School of Economics, where she's still teaching today. We know Lea as a fellow, first and foremost, as a political theorist and political philosopher, who has published widely very widely received book on the dialectic of cosmopolitan claims and state politics, avant-garde, global justice and avant-garde politics, that came out in 2011 or 12, I think, and is somehow tries to somehow square the circle between, in a way, a political community that is a limited political community, a state, and it claims that go beyond that are somehow the claims of the cosmopolitan free and equal. She has published another book with her husband, Jonathan, about partisanship and the question of how it could be conceived as practical philosophers of political parties, in a way an under-researched topic, which was a very powerful and interesting book too. She published co-edited a volume on Kant and colonialism, quite remarkably, quite early in a way. That's a debate we are only starting since some years now. And many other things. I introduced her like that in a way because that's the way we got acquainted to her. And as a political philosopher, she was someone, I can say, from reading her stuff, that is writing a quite analytical style in a way, you have to be interested to that. It's not public interest books. So they're very technical, practical, philosophical books that show her as a political theorist. Could one label, if one liked labels, as something like a Kantian socialist, which is unusual in itself because most critical socialist theorists are perhaps rather Hegelian, or they are not really critical, I would claim. But she lives up to that, and that is a theme very theoretically framed that might come up today when we talk about the book we want to talk today. Because the book that, in a way, made her prominent in another dimension was Free, autobiography. She published in 2021, I think. She wrote, in, I think, most parts at the Vico, which we're very proud of, and that has been translated now into 22 languages, I think, and is a book that really has been read all over the world, got many prizes, and is a much debated piece of, where we see of what, actually. Lea and I plan our 90 minutes like this. She will give a little reading of the beginning because we don't know if everyone has read the book or knows the book. Then we will talk a little bit about it, and then she will read another part at the end, and then we will introduce the public or include the public, into our debate. So Lea, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's always a great pleasure to be at Vico. So the book is in...
bring a copy, it's my copy.
No, sorry, yes. And I also don't know it by heart, so I can't recite it, unfortunately. So I'm going to read the very first 2.5-3 pages of the book from the first chapter, and the title is Stalin. I never asked myself about the meaning of freedom until the day I hugged Stalin. From close up, he was much taller than I expected. Our teacher Nora had told us that imperialists and revisionists like to emphasize how Stalin was a short man. He was in fact not as short as Louis XIV, whose height, she said, they strangely never brought up. In any case, she added gravely, focusing on appearances rather than what really mattered was a typical imperialist mistake. Stalin was a giant, and his deeds were far more relevant than his physique. The thing that made Stalin really special, Nora went on to clarify, was that he smiled with his eyes. Can you believe it? Smiling with your eyes? That's because the friendly mustache that adorned his face covered his lips, so that if you only focused on the lips, You would never know if Stalin was really smiling or doing something else. But you just had to take one look at his eyes, piercing, intelligent, and brown, and then you knew Stalin was smiling. Some people were unable to look you in the eye. They clearly had something to hide. Stalin looked straight at you, and if he felt like it, or if you behaved well, his eyes would smile. He always wore an unassuming coat and plain brown shoes, and he liked to put his right hand under the left side of his coat, as if holding his heart. The left hand he often kept in his pocket. In his pocket? We asked. Isn't it rude to walk with your hand in your pocket? Grown-ups always tell us to take our hands out of our pockets. Well, yes, said Nora, but it's cold in the Soviet Union. And anyway, she said, Napoleon always had his hand in his pocket. Nobody ever said that was rude. Not in his pocket, I said timidly. In his waistcoat. In his time, that was a sign of good upbringing. Teacher Nora ignored me and was about to take another question. And he was short, I interrupted. How do you know? My grandmother told me. What did she tell you? She told me that Napoleon was short, but when Marxist teacher Hegel, I can't remember, saw him, he said one could see the spirit of the world standing on a horse. Hegel, she corrected. Hegel was right. Napoleon changed Europe. He spread the political institutions of the Enlightenment. He was one of the greats, but not as great as Stalin. If Marxist teacher Hegel had seen Stalin standing, obviously not on a horse, but perhaps on a tank, he would have also claimed to have seen the spirit of the world. Stalin was a vital source of inspiration for many more people, for millions of our brothers and sisters in Africa and Asia, not just in Europe. Did Stalin love children? We asked. Of course he did. Even more than Lenin? About the same. But his enemies always tried to hide that. They made Stalin sound worse than Lenin because Stalin was stronger and far, far more dangerous for them. Lenin changed Russia, but Stalin changed the world. This is why the fact that Stalin loved children just as much as Lenin was never properly reported. Did Stalin love children as much as Uncle Enver? Teacher Nora hesitated. Did he love them more? You know the answer, she said with a warm smile. It's possible that Stalin loved children. It's likely that children loved Stalin. What is certain, dead certain, is that I never loved him more than on that wet December afternoon, when I scampered from the port to the little garden near the Palace of Culture, sweaty, shaky, and with my heart pounding so fast I thought I would spit it on the ground. I had run as much as I could for more than a mile when I finally spotted the tiny garden. When Stalin appeared on the horizon, I knew I would be safe. He stood there, solemn as usual, with his unassuming coat, plain bronze shoes, and his right hand under his coat as if supporting his heart. I stopped, looked around to ensure nobody was following me, and went closer. With my right cheek pressed against Stalin's thigh and my arms struggling to circle the back of his knees, I was not visible. I tried to catch my breath, closed my eyes, and began to count. 1, 2, 3. When I got to 37, I could no longer hear the dogs barking. The thundering sound of shoes stamping on concrete had become a distant echo. Only the slogans of protesters occasionally reverberated. Freedom, democracy, freedom, democracy. When I became certain of my safety, I let go of Stalin. I sat on the ground and took a more careful look. The last drops of rain on his shoes were drying out, and the paint on his coat had begun to fade. Stalin was just as teacher Nora had described him, a bronze giant with hands and feet much larger than I'd expected. Tilting my neck backwards, I lifted my head to confirm that his mustache really did cover the upper lip, and that he smiled with his eyes. But there was no smile. There were no eyes, lips, nor even a mustache. The hooligans had stolen Stalin's head. I covered my mouth to suffocate a scream. Stalin, the bronze giant with a friendly mustache who had been standing in the garden of the Palace of Culture since long before I was born, decapitated? Stalin, of whom Hengel would have said that he had seen the spirit of the world in a tank. Why? What did they want? Why did they shout, freedom, democracy, freedom, democracy? What did it mean?
Wonderful. Let me just start with the indiscreet information that you were born in 1979, because I think one thing that is interesting about the book is that it has a very specific symmetry, almost symmetry, and that you were born, and we will come back to that, in 79, that somehow Albania has this kind of late revolution, and that somehow everything changes in a way almost in the middle of the book, and then the book changes too, quite considerably so. But before we come to that, I was wondering, we were talking yesterday about also auto-social biography, and if I think about what Juliane presented to us yesterday and how that fitted or not could fit to this book, so my hypothesis would be to say, in a way, you present as a classless society, I would say that. And this classlessness means that the social is not as interesting as the political and the individual in your book. So there are quite a lot of characters. You cannot really boil it down to their social upbringing because it's somehow basically the same. Then we learn that there are paths that are different. But is there something like individualism under communist conditions because of classlessness? Is that something you can relate to?
Well, I'm not sure if it was a classless society. I mean, there was an ancien regime, and the family that I described that is at the center of the book is, in a way, belongs to that old class. Yeah. And, you know, on my father's side, it was the aristocracy, and on my mother's side, it was the bourgeoisie, the kind of rich bourgeoisie. But I was, as far as I knew, a working class product, and a product of a working class state. And in many ways, the dilemma that the book describes in the first half is exactly that of someone who is an individual with this conflicting upbringing, where the individual is subject to these two weird and different formative influences. On the one hand, the state, through the educational institutions, the school and the nurseries and the media and so on. And on the other hand, the family that is a family that hates the state, and where the individual doesn't actually know, which of these is right and which of these is wrong, and actually doesn't quite even know what they belong to, because they just belong to whatever reality that they grow up in. And so the book is more of an uncovering of then how all these layers of class, of all the different classes that had been part of the historical struggles that this state was in some ways depicting, were always there, even though the rhetoric was that of having overcome and being in a new classless society. And although, again, even there, it was a dictatorship of the proletariat, so it wasn't quite a classless society. It was a society that was fighting to go into communism that was the classless society. So, so I think that's what part of the story in the book is, how you had this concept of biography, where your upbringing and your family and who your parents were and who your grandparents were conditioned your who you were perceived to be as an individual. But on the other hand, the state was also bringing you up as a different kind of individual, as a new socialist woman or man or whatever.
Yeah, but then again, I think when I read the book, so it's very much a book in which the truth comes out peu à peu about who you are, or who your parents are, who your grandparents are, with a very dramatic scheme in a way. And I thought the irony, the sad irony in a way of the book might be to say, the truth doesn't make you free. There seems to be something in the cover-up of your own or your family's biography that is somehow really working out, and why the truth somehow brings a lot of trouble.
Well, I think in part because the truth, one of the things that I want to say about the truth in the book, or that comes out, is that it's always very hard to tell apart truth from ideology, and that every ideological package is always referring to some kernel of truth that they think they're depicting and representing. And that, in fact, the key concept of the book is freedom. And the point is to show the difference between freedom as an ideal, as an aspiration, as a moral concept, and freedom as an ideology and as that which becomes subject to state propaganda in different historical periods with different packaging for different reasons, with different target audiences. So in the end, I think, and so in part the story, yes, it's a kind of coming of age story, so about this individual who finds the truth and so on, but it started as a philosophical book, and what I wanted initially to do was to talk about the difficulties in thinking about freedom free from ideology and from propaganda, which can take more or less pervasive forms in different societies and can shape you in ways that are more obvious or less obvious, sometimes vertically, sometimes horizontally, sometimes individually, sometimes collectively, sometimes through political culture, sometimes through historical references or through a culture of consumerism or whatever. But basically the difficulties of talking about freedom in a way that can separate this concept of freedom from the concept of ideology. And in the end, I think you're right. There is no truth, only insofar as what you get is this fundamental doubt. And I, as a Kantian, think that actually that is the only truth that we have, is criticism. So what the book leaves you with is this idea that it's important to question. And the closest you can get to something like truth is just in this capacity to question everything and to be critical, and then to figure out what forms of criticism are more productive, less productive, and how you can then use them to shape society and to think about who you are in society. But ultimately, I think the result of me finding out the family truths is that it's turned me into a very, very doubtful person. Because, you know, once you've been lied to once, it's really hard to believe that you can be told the truth again. And then, of course, someone is telling you now, this is the true and real society, and this is the really free society. But once you've been in the lie, it's like the evil genius in Descartes, you know, when you can suspend everything and you begin to suspend everything and to be questioning and skeptical. But, you know, if you take that skepticism really far, then you really don't have very much left.
No, it seems to me, but to say that, you know, the result of the, if you want to talk about results, but if the bottom line of the book is that the truth is the doubt, it seems to me a little bit too modest as something I get out of the book as something theoretical. So I think the interesting thing is when you say we have to somehow find we have to find some distinction between ideological uses of freedom and in a way, you know, true or, you know, somehow working usages of truth, is that in a way you start with very much with literary means that show you as a kid, you know, it's a children's perspective. It's everything in the first half of the book is uncommented. Everything somehow happens there in a way. There's a lot of humor in that you know more than the narrator knows. Very classical, very well working in a literary tool that somehow you understand the misunderstanding the narrator doesn't understand. And there's a lot of technique. There are cliffhangers and so on and so forth. But I think it somehow seems to me to boil down to the fact that the non-ideological is much better kept by the kid than by the, you know, adolescent or so. And you get this kind of really dry description, dry in meaning of non-commented, non-reflected, of things that are going on that are in a way as good as you can get in trying to depict a society with non-ideological means. But the twist then obviously is that you have to become, you know, adult, you have to become autonomous. And then you become somehow, you lose your innocence, your cognitive in a certain way. And this seems to me somehow a thread of the book.
Yeah, I think in part because the book was going to be a book about freedom, and I didn't like the worst thing you can do in writing about freedom is to write a book in a paternalistic way and to kind of tell the reader, this is what freedom is, this is how I thought about freedom, these are all these different problems with freedom and so on. And in part also because it's one of the messages of the book is that freedom is a process of searching for freedom, and that involves the reader as much as the writer. So the writer, of course, as you say, has more knowledge because you start from the end when you write the beginning, you know what you're trying to do. But you also want to bring the reader with you on a journey. And the other element of this is that I was very conscious of making a transition from academic writing to a different kind of writing. And again, you know, the worst thing is writing an academic who's been working on freedom all their lives and has very set views on freedom and so on. The worst thing they could do is they start lecturing the audience and the readers on, here is me with my authority and my knowledge and my readings and so on, telling you what freedom consists of. So for me, the child was actually a liberation in many ways, because it was only by inhabiting the child that the academic really had no reason of being there and could be completely excluded. So you enter this child perspective and you become very disciplined in how you're going to write this story. And the child helps you keep yourself on a leash when writing about freedom. So you want to show people what freedom consists of, and you want to engage them in this conversation, and you want to raise questions for them. But the minute you say, and here is the big philosophical debate that I'm revealing to you, and here is the tradition, and here are the sources, and here is the concept, and there's a negative concept of freedom, and a positive concept of freedom, and a Kantian concept of freedom, and so on, that's when you actually completely taken the freedom away from the reader. Yeah. In a way. And as an academic, this is really an insult, in a way, if you're trying to do this other way of being and writing. So the child was really helpful, because every time I thought, could the child, and sometimes I literally checked with my kids if they would say something like this. And you know, when I wrote a chapter about death and the death of Enver Hoxha, I had this 5.5-year-old who talks about death, and I knew from my kids that this is exactly the age in which children start having these very, very deep questions about death and the meaning of life and what happens after and the afterworld and so on. So it helped me inhabit the child. But also, again, going back to philosophy, all of philosophy is in some ways a return to the child, because you have to look at the world with this innocent perspective that questions everything and can only go forward if it starts by not ruling out certain questions as stupid or meaningless or already been answered. And so you have to have a kind of curiosity. You have curiosity and innocence mixed, and that's again what the child perspective helped me do in this transition from this other kind of writing.
Still, there seems to be this twist that when you lose something that is not only something moral, but something, if I may draw this, something cognitive, something that you somehow get, and there's another, in a way, strange movement. I think it seems to me in the book that your emotional life, so the pure sadness of the story, the pity, which is full of it, somehow only comes out when you are older.
Yeah.
So we have read the chapter about the crying girl that seems the decapitated Stalin. That is a funny chapter, and even when you're crying, we don't cry with you. We think that somehow kid is crying, and then the emotions somehow kick in when you're getting older. That is somehow remarkable too.
Yeah. So that's again because I think the book is a coming of age story. So the character grows with the pages and with the book and with the dates moving forward. And so you have a child with all the innocence and the lightness and of course all the tensions as well with the parents. But the child becomes a teenager, and a teenager's perspective on the world is very different from a child's perspective. And it's usually angry and grim and resentful and thinking everyone is stupid and the world is not right and there's something. So the book follows this maturity, entering into maturity, and the child who becomes more and more mature. But the other thing that happens is that in the first part of the book, you have a child who doesn't know and parents who know everything. And then the world is kind of turned upside down. So the child finally knows and stops believing. And the parents enter this new era of believing in everything that happens around them because of their previous lives and their transition. And that was another thing that I think the adolescent perspective enabled me to capture, was this different generational perspective. So there was a generation of people who were children during communism, who experienced society as children and who didn't have political opinions, didn't have first-hand experience of censorship, because you have to be a grown-up to know that your thought is being repressed by the state, or that you have this propaganda that's surrounding you. You have to have a certain political maturity. And on the other hand, the transition happens and parents finally think they become free. And the child has lost the childhood and the innocence of childhood and has entered the dark years of the transition and all the complicated conflicts and both personal and societal, the emigration waves, the unemployment, the shock therapy, all the effects of that. And you no longer experience them as a child. So a child, if I had been a child in 1993, 94, 96, 97, these years, I might have found a way of relativizing or of believing a story. But you are in a different life stage, and so you begin to question, and you become grown up, and you begin to doubt, and then you really doubt, and you're doubting everything because you also have this experience of the truth having been concealed from you. And so then the child, who is now a teenager, doubts everything, and the parents believe everything because it's the new world, and we're now finally being liberated, and they try to convince the child. And I also remember this literally when I was a teenager, that every time I complained that we had no electricity, it was really cold, we had no textbooks because the communist era textbooks had been destroyed and they weren't replaced, there was no printing paper and all this kind of stuff. Every time I went and complained about this, my parents would say, but do you know you would be working in a mine now? Or do you know you might be in a political prison? And so there was this generational gap And everything you said was completely irrelevant to them compared to their trauma and what they were. And you were, on the other hand, also the repository of all their aspirations. Because, you know, they had somehow missed their chance. So it was you who had to realize all their dreams and so on. So if you complained, you were failing on many fronts, but you were especially failing on their hopes because you were taking away this idea that you were the object of something that needs to succeed for them to realize themselves.
I mean, that is very fascinating because there's something incredible about the book that is somehow that you have the literary tool, but the literary tool only works because your lifetime somehow converges, or you becoming an adult converges with two historical seasons, that somehow, that is an accident, but you somehow grasp it and make something literary out of that. That is not purely literary, you know, but it's only, always seems to be Hegelian in a certain way, because it adds up to that story that in a way gets, you know, from white to gray and from gray to black. Because basically we have two moments. We have the 1990 revolution. I will come back to that, and then we have the 1997 Civil War, which is in its meaninglessness, in a way hard to describe. And I read it, and I was wondering. So, let's perhaps talk a little bit about let's say for a moment with the literary instruments you use. So that was an idea. So you wanted to write a theoretical book, and then you saw your own biography, and then you said, okay, I take the child's perspective.
No, actually, that was again a product of contingency. Although on the literary, my friends in Albania joke that I didn't write this book, Enver Hoxha wrote it. So yes, there is a sense in which history writes things for you and puts them in you, and you are what you are because of that history. But on the gestation of the book, no, I was in Berlin, not at Vico, but at the FU, and I was in the pandemic year. So I arrived before the pandemic started, and I started writing this book on freedom in the socialist and liberal traditions, which was my original academic plan. And then COVID happened, and my 3 kids were running around the house, and the school was shut, the nursery was shut, they couldn't go to the playground and so on. And so I was hiding from them, basically. And because they were finding me everywhere, they were chasing me one room after the other, in the bathroom, the kitchen, everywhere, kind of. And they didn't understand, why I was not playing with them, because every day was like the eternal return of a Sunday for them. So from their perspective. And so I was kind of kept hiding, and eventually I found this cupboard in Berlin at the BZ, which is a bit like the Vico cupboards, It's big cupboards, it's German and well done, and there's a lot of space in it, but it's still a cupboard. So you're writing in this cupboard about freedom. And I remember at one point I was literally thinking to myself, here you are, Lea, you were born in communist Albania in 1979, had to go through this stuff, finally arrived in liberal democracy, finally you're in the heart of Europe, in Berlin, what everyone looks up to as this kind of realm of finally realized freedom and so on, and there you are writing from a cupboard. And everyone around you is telling you that, there is a crisis, the world will be very different tomorrow, it's not going to be the same, and you can't travel, you can't go to the park, you can't see your friends, your kids are chasing. I mean, all the constraints of the pandemic, which were obviously all about freedom one way or another, there was this rhetoric around me, which was, we have responsibilities and it's, duties and so on. But at the end of the day, you're still there writing from a cupboard and writing about freedom. And it made me realize that there are moments in history and in life where something very abstract and very complicated and apparently very remote, like freedom, becomes very tangible. And the fact that there is a lack of freedom when you're writing from this cupboard, it's kind of, you don't have to do too many mental acrobatics to figure out that there's a problem there. So, and it occurred to me again that And all the discussion, especially around a new world, but we have responsibilities. And I mean, it's not that I had any sympathy for like no vaxxers, no maskers, but on the other hand, I was also very aware of the fact that there is a discourse here that we're all replicating and reproducing. And some of us with some cognition of what's going on and some with other. And it made me realize, again, that there had been other moments in my life in Albania where, in the past, where you felt like you were at the cusp of something big happening. There's a crisis, everyone's talking about it, everyone's talking about freedom, and there's all these discussions, and sometimes it's ideology, sometimes it's propaganda, sometimes it's aspiration, sometimes it's responsibility, sometimes it's illusion, whatever. And that, I feel, in this something happened. It was a bit like the cells for the monk. You go in this cell and something happens in your mind, and you're no longer in the world that you were inhabiting until that point academically and in your, with Kant and Hegel, but you're with Hegel and and your childhood and the statue and so on. So.
Well, it's interesting that there is, as I said, there's a shift in the middle of the book, December 1990, when you somehow learn about your family, and I think the way the book is then, the aesthetic approach of the book very changes. So at the first half of a book has somehow a narrative pull towards this moment. You see you're more and more prepared that something's going to happen. And then it happens and you're somehow devastated and have to cope. Even as a reader, you're somehow very impressed. And then the second part is more episodic and is more with the real narrator, and you got more reflection and so on and so forth. Is that something that the story did to you or you did to the story?
I think it really was abandoning the child, or the child growing up. I mean, I think I just went with the character, and the character was trying to reconstruct what was going on, because again, you had this kind of observer and the function of the character, of the main character. And I always talk about the character even though it's me, because I think there's this, you're not really the same person as what you write about, and also because your identity is so different after so many years. I don't feel like I'm exactly the same person as the person that I was writing about, but basically, it enabled me to capture these different insights from other people, what they thought about freedom, how they explained it, how they articulate. And the world of the child in this communist period was a narratively coherent world. It was, there is a story there. There is a communist state, and there is enemies, there is Soviet imperialists, American imperialists. You're in this super small state fighting these superpowers, and it was very empowering as a child to be in that position, because you lived this drama of the small state fighting all these superpowers. And at some point, the telos of all that disappears, and it gets replaced by something else, which, since the child has grown up, is not quite as coherent anymore. You've just entered a different phase of your life. And to me, this is why all these observations that I was collecting and all these stories and the perspectives were much more fragmented than the beginnings, because there was, and in part, the first half of the book is a story with a narrative coherence, and the second half is just episodic and much more fragmented. And the child is kind of, who has grown up by that point, completely disoriented by this. And you never really quite get over the disorientation.
No, not in the book at least.
Well, a little bit in the epilogue, I think, but...
Maybe. There are very many wonderful episodes somehow that make you think about the relation between aesthetics and politics. And I think my favorite is actually, there is a guy showing up from the World Bank, and he's somehow a tragic figure in a way in himself. But then he is incapable of individualizing things. He always forgets names. He always forgets locations with a specific proper names. He's always thinking in relations and comparisons that are structural. And this leads some to structural reforms actually in the next chapter. And I think that was an amazing just observation to say, basically people think these are capitalist structuralists that are even unable to confront themselves with the individuality of any form, be it a temporal or be it an event, be it a person. There's actually, do you know, Dominic Pestre, just comes to my mind, Franco Moretti, Dominic Pestre about World Bank speech. They basically make a theoretical piece of the World Bank pronouncement. There's somehow very fits perfectly to the text.
Right.
So is that something is that just an observation? Is that something like, did you have your own theory about that?
Yeah, so there's two characters. The one I just mentioned, which was teacher Nora.
Yes, teacher Nora is one.
And there's two characters that are not central characters. They're kind of marginal characters, but they are the ideologues of their respective eras. And so they convey the taken for granted truths or whatever people think should be the truth about the particular period in which they live. And so teacher Nora is one. She has the truth about socialism and how it's right to fight capitalism. And then there's this other guy who comes in the second part, who is a World Bank expert. And he doesn't quite have, because the other story I wanted to tell in the book was about oppression and the difference between vertical and structural oppression. So the idea that in communist times there was oppression by one authority, the state, the party, and it was vertical and it was on individuals. And in the second part, you lose freedom, but in a different way. It's much more anonymous and much more fragmented, and so there's a kind of structural unfreedom that you can't quite pin down to any particular individual. And so this character, who is in a way the voice speaker of this new era of freedom and capitalism, and preaches free markets and preaches structural reforms and so on, it's not that he has a theory, because usually neoliberals don't really have a theory, and
everyone has
they
a
have a
theory.
they have a kind of insight about what's wrong, but they don't have, Nora, the teacher, she knows what's right because it's communism and it's like a religion. In the case of the World Bank guy, it's much more, he has doubts as well, and so the way he makes sense of the world is by comparison of these different experiences to each other rather than the different experiences to a theory. So the way he comes to terms with transition in Albania is by saying, well, we've done this in Bolivia. Or at some point, the people say to him, look, they try to teach him local things that you need to know to survive. So water is usually, there's a shortage of water, only comes at 2 o'clock. And people try to teach him, you have to go and fill all your water bottles at 2 o'clock, because then if you don't fill them, then there will be no water until tomorrow at 2 o'clock. And he says, oh yeah, I remember this, we had this in Palestine, and at least you don't have bombs here. And so every experience needs to be made sense of by reference to another experience of transition somewhere, even though the particularities of that transition are, in a way, they're irrelevant. And so for him, it's always about comparing this to this experience to this other experience. And that's because that's the only way he can be an expert. Otherwise, he doesn't have the local knowledge and the sort of the detailed, the contextual insight to actually be able to really help the locals navigate the transition. So the only way that he can be an expert of the transition is by saying, I've been in another transition. But which transition from where to what requires a kind of detailed insight that he doesn't have, because he can't have. And so this is what I try to convey, and also the sense that there was really a sense of powerlessness in the 90s vis-a-vis these experts, because they really did come as the experts. The idea was that we had failed, the state had failed, communism had failed, everything else. So you had these authorities that would come, the World Bank or the IMF or the international community, and they came with the new Bibles, and they were kind of preaching the new world. And people sensed that these guys didn't know as much as they pretended to know, or as much as we kind of gave them credit for. But they also knew that they had to play the game to survive. And a lot of the difficulties with the transition were exactly, from the point of view of the outsiders, to know when were the locals really playing the game and when were they actually complying or actually buying what the experts were saying. And from the point of view of locals, it was just to sort of say, yes, it's fine, and then just go on and do something else.
Now, yesterday, if I'm going to my yesterday, talked about the rights of the dead in books and what kind of, morals there should be perhaps applied to it. But we have a lot of living people in that book, actually. And so what do they say?
Yeah, so the way I got around, well, the good thing about living people is that you can ask them for consent, and maybe their consent is not informed, or maybe it's it's driven by something else, or you can manipulate it in some ways and you can shape it, but at least you can pretend you have their consent. So the character that I was most worried about, well, my mother and my brother were kind of people close to me that I was most worried about, this ethics of how do you write about someone who is in your family and you're giving a lot of detail about their lives and so on. The way I went about that was, when I finished the book, to give it and translated it to Albanian, I gave it to my mother and I said, everything you don't like, just take out. And she took out quite a lot. And I actually destroyed everything that she took out. So I don't even have it. So nobody can actually, they can't say to me, now we want to know what your mother took out. Because I don't even remember. I just really literally deleted the files, emptied the trash bin. And so I tried to be very conscientious about this. Having said that, she knows she's a character, and a character is always different from a real person, and she also knows that she has to perform a function in the book. And what I found hardest actually about writing, even with her consent, was that I was ascribing her an interpretation of the world, which I knew that she also had doubt about, but I was giving her, as a character, a kind of coherence that she herself in her life didn't always have, because we never have that coherence. We always have moments of, we're not sure, we don't know, one day we're one thing, one day we're another thing, and I had taken that away from her. And in that sense, I was saying to her, look, you're a character. You're not like a real person, and
But there's the family, and I will come back to that too, but there's also the community, the political community, so there's Albania. Yeah. So what is Albania saying to the book?
Well, so that was another, that's another very interesting debate. The book was very polarized reception in Albania, very different from other countries, including other Eastern European countries. So at first I thought maybe this is a kind of East-West, so people who have a communist past will relate to the book in some way, and people who don't have that, they won't. But actually, although there was a difference in reception in terms of Western Europeans were more focused on the first part of the book and on the Coca-Cola can and sort of some stories in the kind of communist period, in Eastern Europe or post-communist countries, it was mainly the second part, the transition and the sort of fragmentation, and then they related to the kind of gloomy way of writing about all that. So that there was a difference, but it wasn't generally controversial anywhere other than in Albania. But in Albania, it was really controversial, and for several reasons. So one of them was that I write about the communist period from the point of view of someone who belongs to a family who is a victim of the system, but who still says at the end of the book, I'm a socialist. And this was really perceived by some people who came from that background as just a betrayal of all the things that your family, your ancestors, your relatives, everything kind of stands for that. So that was one aspect, was just the political polarization and the way in which the debate was really kind of crashed into, is this an attempt to talk about communism in a certain way, or why is she not talking enough about victims and prisons? I mean, I talk about that as well, but there's a lot about daily life as well. And somehow they felt that the balance between the way you describe society during communism was there was not enough of the perspective of the victim, even though it was about the victim's family in a way. But I wasn't the right kind of victim, because I was a victim who had still turned to the left. So it was almost like you're kind of betraying your own roots and so on. And I have an explanation for that. We can talk about that, because I think it's an interesting debate. The other thing that I feel that played an important role is that although this was a memoir in many ways, or it's a first personal account, there aren't that many memoirs or first personal accounts from Albania published and translated all over the world and so on. And so it's inevitable that to that public, this will become representative of the entire nation. And there's a lot of people who don't feel represented, because although you kind of claim universality, it's still always a particular perspective on it. So I felt they were right in that, to be really annoyed, because they were like, why is this book about Albania? Everybody's talking about this perspective as though this was the truth about communism, the transition, what followed after, how Albanians feel now, and so on. And of course, nobody asked other Albanians what they thought. Nobody translated other Albanians. Nobody published them. So it was inevitably related to coming from the margins and not having enough voices that would counter, or that would give you a more pluralistic debate. And so I think people felt this has now become the official story about Albania, and a lot of them didn't agree, and I think they were right not to agree, because they weren't represented. So.
And there's obviously something unique about Albania, and that is that somehow there is no revolutionary joy going on, it seems, because in a way they are repeating something in 1990 that everyone else has already done in 1989. From the perspective of somehow a double front, being neither belonging to the West nor belonging to the like organized East, and therefore somehow losing something really specific. And that's interesting, because that makes it. I mean, you can say when you read about memoirs about Poland or recent Germany or Czechoslovakia back then, there's this kind of miraculous moment, not for everybody and so on and so forth, but still where people say, okay, now we're having a revolution. And I think this doesn't really come up in Albania somehow.
Well, I mean, I don't know, because I think in some ways you're right. There was you weren't joining forces with others in this revolutionary joy of 1989. In 1989, I was just learning about Stalin and Verhoeven and Lenin and so on, just like any other day of my life. And that continued for a whole year, which is a really long time, if you think about that. So. Yes. And it only the changes really started happening at the end of 1990. So 12 months go by, and there is a sense that this world is changing, but you're not going to change with it, because you have this very distinctive communist experience, which was always isolated from the Soviets, and Albania left the Warsaw Pact, and when the Soviets invaded Prague, and so it was a very unique relationship to history. But on the other hand, I think there was a joy, because they were almost left out, and then they weren't. And I remember my parents, it was always it was a cautious joy, because it was so sui generis. You never knew that it was over for forever and for good. So you never knew something was going to happen in the party, and everything would be reversible in a way. So they were always extremely cautious until quite a lot longer, even after political pluralism had been declared in Albania, and there was an official announcement that said there would be no political prisoners. The political prisoners were freed, and And even at that point, I remember my family weren't out. My mom had actually joined the opposition in secret from my father because she didn't want to announce that she had become a dissident officially because she was worried about repercussions in the family and she was worried about what. And of course, the other thing in my family was that because they were already dissident in 1946, my grandmother always had these memories of voting against the communists in 1946 in this kind of officially free elections, and then her husband, after a few months, went to prison for 15 years. So it's not like, the first free elections, they weren't that excited to go and vote because they didn't know what would happen after the first free election. Maybe they're called free, but they're not free. And so there's a sense of not knowing without hindsight, what is actually going to happen. Yeah. So there's complete confusion. Although I think there was joy, but it was all secret.
I remember that when I'm 10 years older than you, and I remember in '89 I was in my first semester, and somehow you even if you were not an expert, so you just pursued the map and you saw, okay, there's the Karlsplatz in Prague, there are demonstrations, there's Solidarność, there's this huge thing going on in the Baltics. There's Hungary that somehow started some of the stuff with regard to Germany. So and then they're still there. No, I really remember myself somehow spring '90. I must have somehow noticed that there's nothing going on actually, at least from what could be seen from outside.
I have to say, when I think about what happened, because we could pick in Albania, we could pick Italian television and Yugoslav television, and both of these played a critical function in society because they weren't. The Yugoslav perspective was very different from the Albanian perspective, so the television really conveyed, in addition to erotic movies, which we didn't have, a lot of other things as well. So basically, I remember the Berlin Wall completely went by without me even noticing anything at all. And I was 10, so it's not like I wasn't young. I would remember this. 10-year-olds in the West remember the Berlin Wall. So I don't have a single memory about the Berlin Wall. What I do remember from Yugoslav television was the shooting of Ceausescu. Yeah. And that because tough. Albania was thought of itself as a little bit closer to Romania in terms of experience and in terms of hardship of communism and so on. That I remember asking my parents what's going on, and they were trying to hide what was going on, and so on. And it was just, and Solidarność also was discussed a bit in the Italian television, and I remember asking them about that, and my dad was like, no, because every Tuesday we would write a newsletter of political information in school. And so I remember whenever I did political information, I was trying to figure out what's relevant, what's going on politically. And when I mentioned Solidarność, she said, no, it's not very interesting. Let's write about this cooperative. Let's write about this cooperative overcoming its targets for the 5-year plan and the new progress of the 9th Communist Party Congress and so on. And so I remember those kinds of conversations. But the Berlin Wall, really nothing. It's a complete blind spot for me.
I was just thinking, just to come back to the question before, just as an interjection, so it was controversial in Albania, so what was the controversial in Albania? So I thought when I read the book at the end, when you say, I left and I never came back, you just tell them you're done with it. And that is always something hard to swallow for people who are still there, whatever function, whatever success, and so somehow you're getting over Albania with the book, and that is... that cannot make anybody happy who is there, I would assume. Yeah,
maybe, and maybe that explains why it's so popular with the diaspora.
Yeah,
and not as popular with people who are left. But it is an experience of a lot of Albanians who are migrating, and it's kind of. And I wanted to convey that as well, that there was this country, the price of freedom was that it lost a lot of its people that were there, and who just stopped believing in anything and could only find alternatives and solutions in another country rather than just staying there and working. So.
Now, perhaps at the end, before you give us a second reading, we're open to the audience. Let's perhaps get a little bit into the politics of the book very shortly. In a way, when you read the first half, and that is an impression that still remains after reading the second half, it could be read as a quite conservative book, because it's an idyllic account of a somehow, despite all troubles, functioning family and a functioning community. At the very beginning, when you were born, they say, you couldn't have survived without that family. We have these amazing scenes when 15, they are somehow getting for the World Bank guy, 15 families put together in a great party, and you have all this kind of collective effort, and there is something seems to be deeply well-functioning within Albanian society and within your family that would make any, conservative communitarian somehow happy.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't say it's functioning. I think what it is, it's solidarity in scarcity.
Yes.
And that's one aspect of it. And the other aspect is solidarity in scarcity in the absence of capitalist market structures where you can just buy services.
Yeah.
So, you know, what I talk about in the first part of the book is how childcare was outsourced to the neighbors because you didn't have an app, but you also you couldn't phone a service and say, I need a babysitter for my kids if I have to work. So that just wasn't available. And so all of these things were performed by the community as a way of surviving together and by the family, and the family structure was really important. That's one aspect of it. And the other aspect of it is that, yeah, these are not societies that have been deeply penetrated by the markets, by the kind of free market. Eventually, all of this disappears because it's just part of the new world that, you know, you buy services, you have stuff, you can hire a cleaner, or you can hire a babysitter, or you don't need to do, or, you know, if you have a wedding, I talk about in the communist period how people would literally pool resources together and, you know, go to the local school and bring together the desks and have chairs and have desks and have this kind of weddings that were organized by the community. But if you have a wedding provider, someone you just pay for, you don't need the community to do that anymore. And the other thing is that, of course, in the new society, not everyone can afford this. So not everyone can afford to kind of pay a wedding service. But the rhetoric and the new discourse is that those who can't, it's because they have failed as individuals, because the possibility that society would enable you to do all these things is now there. So the state is the right state, you're in the right system, you have the right form of justice and so on. And so if you don't make it, if you can't afford to buy a wedding service, if you get wed, well, you know, why should anyone be responsible for you? Whereas in the communist period, you didn't have that because you didn't have this rhetoric of, you know, the individual is necessarily the one who is going to face all the hardships. And it wasn't a form of, there was no blame for injustice, for poverty, for social exclusion. It was something that you had to shoulder together. And in the second post-90, that's exactly what changes. People are blamed for being unemployed or blamed for not being lazy or for underperforming. So then why would you help the poor? You can only assist in the form of charity, not in the form of solidarity. And that's exactly what's not there in the kind of communist Albania. There's no charity, it's only solidarity.
Now, is that the reason, man? Still, it's interesting to see, man, when you have the choice between socialism and liberalism, and you say, you know, between socialism that somehow destroyed the life of the generation of your grandparents, and liberalism that somehow destroyed the life of the generation of your parents, one would wonder, okay, maybe that is a wrong choice, but you seem to be rather voting for socialism at the end. Is that the reason? So is that the possibility of an idyllic scarcity, is that maybe the material reason, because we don't get a reason at the end?
No, because I didn't want to, I didn't want to kind of lecture people on, you know, but I wanted to be honest with where I am in terms of, and, you know, if I read the epilogue, so that's where I am now, and that's why I wanted to have the epilogue. I didn't want to leave the reader with this uncertainty about what is this person doing now, what do they think, and so on. But for me, the question of, you know, socialism and capitalism is never a question of how do these systems compare to each other. It's about how do they compare to the idea of freedom, and what kind of moral presuppositions does each of them have. And to me, because of all my, you know, Kantian theory about freedom, and freedom is a social relation, and it's morality, and so on, it's not something that you can do as an individual. You have to have something with others that is at the core of it. And that's why in the end I say, look, I think about socialism as a theory of freedom, and I don't like capitalism because I don't think capitalism has the same ethos. So for me, it's not about what does each of them deliver compared to each other, and what do each of them deliver compared to one life, but what are the fundamental moral ideals that underpin each of them? And I think, and that's where you kind of begin to build a social critique. And then you can be critical of everything, because, you know, I think communist Albania failed by the standards of moral socialism, and capitalist Albania also failed by the standards of moral socialism. But it's not about, you know, you can't really compare because you're not comparing like for like. You don't have the same metric, you don't have the same, it's very different. The system of values is very different. But what you can do is you can ask the moral question behind every system and say, well, what is this system trying to promote? And I think this question behind both of them is freedom. So this is also part of my, you know, returning to socialism, is that a lot of people think of it as equality and so on. Some stuff I read in the epilogue.
Yeah, it's nice, man. For a German reader, there's something almost moving when you like your own tradition, that there's always a little bit of this German subtext. So it's sort of about inner freedom, and you think, okay, that is not very socialist category, it's a very much Kantian one, but then your beloved grandmother, she's quoted one about, you know, freedom and necessity. That sounds very Schiller to me. Freiheit ist die Einsicht in Notwendigkeit, and one about, you know, Fressen und Moral, but reverse, you know, erst kommt die Moral, dann kommt das Fressen. That's quite remarkable. And that's just an add-on from a German reader. That is somehow a funny element. I think it's high time that you give us a second reading, and then we ask the audience to have some questions.
Good. And the second reading kind of continues this, so maybe we'll elaborate a bit on that perspective. So, okay, so this is the epilogue then, which again is sort of written from many years after the book's finished. So the book finishes in '97 with the Civil War and my departure from Albania and so on, and this is now the present. Each year, I begin my Marx courses at the London School of Economics by telling students that many people think of socialism as a theory of material relations, class struggle, or economic justice, but that in reality, something more fundamental animates it. Socialism, I tell them, is above all a theory of human freedom, of how to think about progress in history, of how we adapt to circumstances, but also try to rise above them. Freedom is not sacrificed only when others tell us what to say, where to go, how to behave. A society that claims to enable people to realize their potential, but fails to change the structures that prevent everyone from flourishing, is also oppressive. And yet, despite all the constraints, we never lose our inner freedom, the freedom to do what is right. I skip the part where I talk about my family and what happened to them, and I start from a paragraph where I talk about the fact that my mother was chasing her properties in Albania, and at some point she was working as a cleaner in Italy, and at some point her properties were returned to her, and so she became very wealthy. So, I was in Italy studying at that time when my mom suddenly went. It was like these kind of British 18th, 19th century novels where you're very, very poor and then suddenly you're really rich. And so I talk about, and I was on a scholarship studying in Italy at that point. I no longer needed to count my last pennies until the next scholarship installment. I could enjoy meals out and drink late in bars discussing politics with my new university friends. Many of those friends were self-declared socialists. Western socialists, that is. They spoke about Rosa Luxemburg, Leon Trotsky, Salvador Allende, or Ernesto Che Guevara as secular saints. It occurred to me that they were like my father in this respect. The only revolutionaries they considered worthy of admiration were those that had been murdered. These icons showed up on posters, T-shirts, and coffee cups, much like the way photos of Enver Hoxha would show up in people's living rooms when I was growing up. When I pointed this out, my friends wanted to know more about my country. But they did not think that my stories from the 80s were in any way significant to their political beliefs. Sometimes, my appropriating the label of socialists to describe both my experiences and their commitments was considered a dangerous provocation. We used to go to a large open-air concert in Rome for 1st May, and I could not help but reminisce about the parades of my childhood on Workers' Day. What you had was not really socialism, they would say, barely concealing their irritation. My stories about socialism in Albania and references to all the other socialist countries against which our socialism had measured itself were at best tolerated, as the embarrassing remarks of a foreigner still learning to integrate. The Soviet Union, China, the German Democratic Republic, Yugoslavia, Vietnam, Cuba. There was nothing socialist about them either. They were seen as the deserving losers of a historical battle that the real, authentic bearers of that title had yet to join. My friend's socialism was clear, bright, and in the future. Mine was messy, bloody, and of the past. And yet the future they sought, and that which socialist states had once embodied, found inspiration in the same books, the same critiques of society, the same historical characters, but to my surprise, they treated this as an unfortunate coincidence. Everything that went wrong on my side of the world could be explained by the cruelty of our leaders, or the uniquely backward nature of our institutions. They believed there was little for them to learn. There was no risk of repeating the same mistakes, no reason to ponder what had been achieved and why it had been destroyed. Their socialism was characterized by the triumph of freedom and justice, mine by their failure. Their socialism would be brought about by the right people, with the right motives, under the right circumstances, with the right combination of theory and practice. There was only one thing to do about mine: forget it. But I was reluctant to forget. It's not that I felt nostalgic. It's not that I romanticized my childhood. It's not that the concepts I had grown up with were so deeply rooted in me that it was impossible to disentangle myself. But if there was one lesson to take away from the history of my country and my family, it was that people never make history under circumstances they choose. It's easy to say what you had was not the real thing, applying that to socialism or liberalism, to any hybrid of ideas and reality. It releases us from the burden of responsibility. We're no longer complicit in moral tragedies created in the name of great ideas, and we don't have to reflect, apologize, and learn. We're doing a reading group on Das Kapital, a friend told me one day. If you join it, you will learn about real socialism. And so I did. When I read the opening pages on the preface, it felt a bit like hearing French, a foreign language I had been taught as a child but rarely practiced. I remembered many of the key words: capitalists, workers, landlords, value, profit, and they echoed inside my head in the voice and simplified formulations of my teacher Nora. Individuals, Marx wrote in the opening pages, are dealt with only insofar as they are the personifications of economic categories, embodiments of particular class relations and class interests. But for me, behind every personification of an economic category, there was the flesh and blood of a real person. Behind the capitalist and the landlord, there were my great-grandfathers. Behind the workers, there were the Roma who worked at the port. Behind the peasants, the people with whom my grandmother was sent to work in the fields when my grandfather went to prison and about whom she always spoke condescendingly. It was impossible to finish reading and just move on. My mother finds it difficult to understand why I teach and research Marx, why I write about the dictatorship of the proletariat. She sometimes reads my articles and finds them baffling. She has learned to weather awkward questions from relatives. Do I really believe these ideas are convincing or feasible? How is it possible? Mostly she keeps her criticisms to herself. Only once did she draw attention to a cousin's remark that my grandfather did not spend 15 years locked up in prison so that I would leave Albania to defend socialism. We both laughed awkwardly and then paused and changed the topic. It left me feeling like someone who is involved in murder, as if the mere association with the ideas of a system that destroyed so many lives in my family were enough to make me the person responsible for pulling the trigger. And deep down, I knew this is what she thought. I always wanted to clarify, but didn't know where to start. I thought that it would take a book to answer. This is that book. At first, it was going to be a philosophical book about the overlapping ideas of freedom in the liberal and socialist traditions. But when I started writing, just like when I started reading Das Kapital, ideas turned into people, the people who made me who I am. They loved and fought each other. They had different conceptions of themselves and of their obligations. They were, as Marx writes, the product of social relations for which they were not responsible, but they still tried to rise above them. They thought they'd succeeded. But when their aspirations became reality, their dreams turned into my disillusionment. We lived in the same place, but in different worlds. These worlds overlapped only briefly, and when they did, we saw things through different eyes. My family equated socialism with denial, the denial of who they wanted to be, of the right to make mistakes and learn from them, to explore the world. I equated liberalism with broken promises, the destruction of solidarity, the right to inherit privilege, turning a blind eye to injustice. In some ways, I have gone full circle. When you see a system change once, it's not that difficult to believe that it can change again. Fighting cynicism turns into what some might call a moral duty. To me, it's more of a debt that I feel I owe to all the people of the past who sacrificed everything, because they were not apathetic, they were not cynical, they did not believe that things fall into place if you just let them take their course. If I do nothing, their efforts will have been wasted. Their lives will have been meaningless. My world is as far from freedom as the one my parents tried to escape. Both fall short of that ideal. But their failures took distinctive forms. And without being able to understand them, we will always be divided. I wrote my story to explain, to reconcile, and to continue the struggle.